So for these last couple Sundays, we've had the opportunity last week to be in Psalm 14, and today we're going to look at Psalm 3. And I think this is a beautiful psalm, and hopefully you will track along with me as we kind of follow along with David, because David is writing this as he is on the run. So I want to look at just the heading. It says, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. Now, I don't know how many of you know exactly what was going on, but in those days, what happened is David is about 58 years old, and of course he is king of Israel, and it's been 40 years since Samuel came and found David at his home with his father Jesse and anointed him as king. So 40 years has transpired. David's probably about 18 years old, maybe 17 years old. Now David is about 58 years old, and so that time has transpired. But it's also been 27 years since he's actually become king. So there was 13 years of when he was young, and Saul was chasing him and envious of him, jealous of him, and all those type of things. It was 13 years, and then he became king, and so he's been king 27 years. So he is on the last third of his kingship. And so Absalom, his son, is coming to take over the kingship and even to kill David. He's about to remove him. Now, first of all, you say, wait a minute. Why in the world would his son, who is 24 years old, want to kill him and dethrone him? Well, it's a lot behind that, Number one, it is because David had sexual relations with Bathsheba. You remember that? He was supposed to be out leading the armies into war, and instead he stayed home, and as a result of staying home, he is looking off his rooftop. He sees this young lady taking a bath. Her name is Bathsheba. He calls for her, and then he ends up having sexual relations with her, and she ends up becoming pregnant. And then because he wanted to hide the fact that he had gotten her pregnant, he had her husband Uriah killed. He sent word to Joab the general that when they are going to attack the Ammonites, that they were supposed to pull back so that Uriah would be killed. And so Nathan, the prophet, comes to David later on and tells him this story about this one individual who had all these sheep, and then he went and he stole this other sheep from this poor guy. And David is upset, and he says, man, that individual has to pay. And Nathan the prophet tells him that, David, you are the man. And then God tells David that because of his sin with Bathsheba and killing of Uriah, that the sword will never leave his family. Matter of fact, the people in his family will rise up against him. Well, this is what it is. Years later, Absalom is that individual who is being risen up to kill him. Now, why is he going to kill him? Why does he want to kill him? Because, you understand, David had multiple wives, and that means he had multiple kids. And so there was one of his sons who is called Amnon, who raped his half-sister Tamar. So Amnon raped Tamar. Well, what happened? Absalom is a full sibling of Tamar. So he was taking revenge on Amnon. So he killed Amnon. But Absalom was also upset because David was not doing anything about it. And from Absalom's standpoint, David no longer deserved to be king because he was not acting righteously. And Absalom decided that he is going to be king and he is going to dethrone his father. I mean, man, this is, if you talk about a drama going on, this is a drama. So now Absalom is on his way to Jerusalem to dethrone David, to kill David. And David is writing this psalm in the midst of fleeing from his son Absalom. And that's where we are right here in verse 1. It says, "O Lord, how my adversaries have increased. Many are rising up against me." And of course, he is talking about Absalom and the young warriors who are behind him. He now has a great posse. He has strong men, and these individuals are coming for him. Now, you remember, David, these must have been some serious warriors that were on Absalom's side, because you remember David and his mighty men. I mean, David was doing a number of great feats and raiding and doing all these type of things because he had these mighty men following him. Well, now he is established. He's a king. He's older. And Absalom now has mighty men that are coming from David. And David is crying out to the Lord as he is fleeing from Jerusalem. This is what he says in verse 2. "Many have saying of my soul, there is no deliverance from him in God, Selah." He says, wait a minute, there's a number of people who are saying that God is not going to deliver me because of my sin, that this is what I deserve because of the fact that I had relations with Bathsheba, because of the fact that I had Uriah killed. This is my just desert. And they are saying that God will not deliver me. And then he says, Selah. It is a time to pause and to reflect upon that thought. And when we think about this, many of us will probably say, well, that's probably true. He is reaping what he sows. He did this sin and he thought he could hide it. And so God says, hey, you know what? Evil is not going to depart from your family. The sword is going to be there. And so David, now you are suffering the consequences of your sin. I just want to say this right here. Even as believers in Jesus Christ, two things we should understand. And number one, we will still reap what we sow. If we sin, if we do evil, that evil will come back to find us in some way. It may be years later, but God says, hey, you know what? I will not be mocked. For whatever a man sows, that shall he also reap. So that's number one. But number two is this, that even though David knows that this is a result of his own sin, he still cries out to God for deliverance, right? He still cries out to God. And so we as believers need to understand that even if the situation we are in is because of something that we've done, we still need to depend upon the Lord. So he says, think about this now in verse 3. Even though these other individuals are saying that God is not going to deliver him, that he is getting his just desert, David, from his standpoint, says this: "But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, and the one who lifts my head." David still says, you know what, even in the midst of this, I know that you are true, and I know some things about you. Number one, Lord, you are a shield around me. You are my protector, even in this situation. And number two, Lord, you are my glory. In other words, all that I have is a result of you, that you are getting glory out of my life, and you are my glory. And then number three, Lord, you are the one who lifts up my head. You are the one who elevates me. You are the one who has taken me from being a shepherd in my father's house and has elevated me to kingship. And so even though Absalom is coming for me, I still know that you are God. See, we need to remember. We need to remember who God is to us in the difficult times. Yeah, we need to recall who he is in the good times. God is a provider, that God is a sustainer, that God is a lover, that God is someone who I can count on, so that in the difficult times we can remember what we knew about him in the good times. And so David is crying out to God, but he remembers who God is to him. Now, verse 4. He says, I was crying to the Lord with my voice, and he answered me from his holy mountain, Selah. It says it again, Selah. You know, this is interesting because if you notice here, and I just want to say this, if you have the NIV, the tense does not change. It continues to say present. However, if you have what I have, the New American Standard Version, or you have the ESV, the English Standard Version, or if you have the New King James Version, it stays true to the original text. And in the original text, here in verse 4 and 5, it now takes on a past tense. So what's happening is verses 1 through 3, David is writing these as he is leaving, that he is escaping out of Jerusalem. But when he gets down here to these verses, he is looking back on something that has transpired. The psalm wasn't written all at one time. It was written in pieces. And so he says here in verse 4, looking back on verses 1 through 3, I was crying to the Lord with my voice, and he answered me from his holy mountain. I was crying as we were leaving Jerusalem, as our group in the palace, in the region of Jerusalem, as we were leaving, I was crying out to the Lord with my voice. And guess what? The Lord answered my prayer. In other words, Absalom did not kill me, nor did he capture me. God made a way out of Jerusalem. And God heard me from his holy mountain, and he delivered me. That's what he's trying to say. See, one of the things I love about David is this. David is not ashamed of his situation. David cried out. He didn't care that these people were hurt. Matter of fact, he knew the people would have heard, but he was more concerned that God heard. And now that God has delivered him, he can look back and he can see God's hand in his deliverance. Not only did God deliver him out of that situation in Jerusalem, but he also says that I lay down in verse 5, I lay down and slept and I woke, for the Lord sustains me. Now, one thing I missed in verse 4, so I want to go back there because I missed the Selah, right? So here it is in verse 2. He says, those individuals say that God's not going to deliver me. But in verse 4, he's saying that the Lord heard his prayer from his holy mountain. In other words, God did deliver me. And so it's a drop the mic moment. He's saying, I know what they said, but I'm telling you what he did. Now, in verse 5, he goes on, he says, I not only did God deliver me, but I lay down and I slept, past tense. I woke, past tense, for the Lord sustains me. David says, not only did God deliver me out of Jerusalem, but God gave me a good night's sleep. I was able to trust him. And I slept and I woke. You know why I had a good night's sleep? Because it is the Lord himself who sustains me. Brothers and sisters, let me say this. Yes. You can judge or measure your faith based upon how much you can rest in God during tough times. David was on the run. He cried out to God. He believed that God was going to deliver him. God delivered him. And not only did God deliver him, but God gave him a sense of peace and rest even in the midst of the situation. The situation is not over. Absalom is still looking for David. And David knows it. But yet in the midst of that, he is still able to have peace, so much so that he can sleep well at night. Let me ask you this question. Let me just ask you this question. How well do you sleep when there is something that is troubling you going on? You know, most of us, we tend to pray and we give it to God, and then we turn around and we take it back from him. You know, we give it to him again, and then after a while we take it back. And so we take it back so much that we never actually give it to him to the point where now we can rest in God. You know, I was thinking about, of course, some of you know, we got a little dog now. He's about 9 months old. I call him. His name is Teddy, and you know, Teddy's kind of interesting. He's a Yorkie Poo, Cavapoo, you know. So anyway, he's half poodle, so he's pretty smart. You know, those poodles are pretty smart. And so, you know, I try to play this game with him in the backyard. I have a little tennis ball, and so I'll throw him the tennis ball. Man, I can throw it all the way to the other end of the yard, and he gets that tennis ball. Man, he's taking off, and he gets that tennis ball. He turns around, and he's coming back towards me. I'm like, okay, great. You know, we're gonna have a nice little game of fetch here. And so then I reach out my hand to get the ball, and he goes to the side, and he keeps the ball in his mouth. And so I got to go over there and actually grab the ball and wrestle the ball from his jaws. And so then I say, okay, well, I throw it again. He takes off and gets it, and he goes, gets it, and he comes back so far, and he goes over there, and he's got the ball again, and now he's holding on even tighter. So many of us are like that dog. That God is saying, give me your problems, give me your issues, give me your anxieties, give me those things that are keeping you up at night so that you might rest in me. And we say, no, I'm hanging on to this, You know, this is this is my favorite anxiety. This is my favorite tension. I don't want to get that up. You know, and look here. Look at David was able, he was not conflicted. When he gave it to God, he gave it to God. And then he knew that he could rest in God. And even when he is unconscious, that God is the one who will sustain him in the midst of his problems. So that's a good word for us. A good word for us today. So then he says here in verse 6, I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me round about. Arise, O Lord, save me. Oh my God, for you have smitten all my enemies on the cheek. You have shattered the teeth of the wicked. David, as he reflects upon the fact, you know, maybe he woke up and he's refreshed and life is good and he realized God sustained him. And, you know, he now remembers, wait a minute. My God have smitten thousands. God has done great things. If I have led armies, God has done great things in my ministry and in my leadership. When I was on the run from Saul, God did fabulous things. As I became a king, God did tremendous things. In other words, now I recall all the great things that God has done. And so my plea is, God, arise and save me. Save me ultimately from this situation that I am in. You have saved me partially. You got me out of Jerusalem. You have given me a good night's sleep. You've allowed me to think clearer now. But what I need, God, is for you to take care of this whole situation with Absalom, and I need you to intervene and to take care of business. And I can guarantee you that David was sure that God would do that. Now, here's the amazing thing about all of this, right? The amazing thing about all this. All this is happening to David because of a choice he made years earlier. He made a dumb decision, a couple dumb decisions, a couple sinful decisions, and he's suffering the consequences. But even in the midst of suffering the consequences, he still has confidence in God. He repented. He realized that he was the one that Nathan was talking about. And he's turned his life around. And now that there are consequences, he's still trusting in God. Brothers and sisters, let me say this. So many of us, we run from God when we make mistakes. So many of us, we're excited about God in the good times, and then we end up doing something that was, dumb, or it was sinful, or whatever. And because of either shame or we don't think God can forgive us, we run the other way. Let David be an example. David didn't run the other way. David ran to God. And then finally he says here in verse 8, salvation or deliverance belongs to the Lord. Now I want you to look at this. Look at this. Don't miss it. Don't miss it. In verse 2, he says, many are saying to my soul, there is no deliverance for him in God. And he says, Selah, think about that. But here it is in verse 8, he's saying salvation belongs to the Lord. In other words, God has delivered me from the hands of Absalom, and he will deliver me totally from his hands. So he makes a prayer. Your blessings be upon your people. God, just as you have blessed me, may your blessings be upon your people. He knows that God will deliver him from this situation. He doesn't know when, he doesn't know how, but he wants the same blessings that he's experienced to be upon all of God's people. And then he ends, Selah. Think about that. When we find ourselves in situations where people think, hey, you know what? There's no hope for her. There's no hope for him. They're getting what they deserve. We need to remember Psalm 3. When everybody is saying that there is no deliverance for her in God, there is no deliverance for him in God, there is no deliverance for them in God. Remember David. Salvation or deliverance belongs to the Lord, and he is the one who decides whether he delivers someone or not. Do you need deliverance? Do you need God's salvation? Well, trust in him. Remind yourself who he is to you and see what he does. Father God, we come to you right now. We thank you for this psalm. We thank you for the reminder that even in the midst of our fleeing, even in the midst of being persecuted, we can trust in you. Lord, there may be some right now who are watching and listening to this that are dealing with circumstances and situations. And I pray that your blessings would be upon them and that they would trust you even in the midst of their trials and tribulations and anxieties, because you are the one who sustains us. May you get the glory. It's in Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.